Does every culture have a flood story? From the Babylonian Gilgamesh to the biblical Noah, from ancient India to Iceland to the Indigenous Australians, why are there so many flood stories from around the world? The fact that so many cultures around the world have a flood legend is often used to justify the idea that there really was a global flood, and every culture has a collective memory of this single event. But when you actually drill down and look at the individual stories, is that really what's going on? So I'm going to take you on a journey around the world, looking at different flood myths from every continent, well, except Antarctica. Along the way, we're going to discover the answer to the question, why do so many cultures have a flood legend? Are these echoes of a universal shared experience, or are some cultures borrowing stories from others? To explore this, let's start with our oldest surviving flood myths from Mesopotamia. The oldest surviving story comes from Sumer, preserved in fragments within the poem The Death of Gilgamesh and the longer Eridu Genesis. These texts date to within a few hundred years of 2000 BCE. In the Sumerian tale, King Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki of a plan by the other gods to send a great flood and destroy humanity. Ziusudra survives the flood in a large boat. When the waters recede, he offers sacrifices to the gods. In the end, he is granted immortality. The Assyrians told a version of this flood story with a different hero, Atrahasis. Enki warns Atrahasis that the chief god Enlil plans to wipe out humanity with a great flood. One surviving text called the Ark Tablet preserves a detailed account of the instructions Enki provides. He tells him to build a circular boat which measured to 14,400 cubits squared, and he commands Atrahasis to bring animals on board, 2 by 2. The flood lasts 7 days and nights. Afterward, Atrahasis makes sacrifices, and while he isn't granted immortality, in one version the gods promise not to flood the world again. Perhaps the most famous flood story outside the Bible is Gilgamesh. This narrative was adapted by the Babylonians in the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically in Tablet 11 of the standard Babylonian version. This tablet dates to around 700 BCE, but the story is likely older. On a quest for immortality, the hero Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, a human granted eternal life by the gods. Intrigued, Gilgamesh insists on uncovering the secret to Utnapishtim's immortality. Utnapishtim recounts how he was warned by the god Ea, another name for Enki, to build a cube-shaped vessel measuring 14,400 cubits squared, similar to Atrahasis's. Utnapishtim gathered his family, supplies, and animals aboard as the flood raged for 6 days and 7 nights. The ark eventually rests on a mountain, but unsure if the land is dry, he sends out a dove and then a swallow. Both returned. Finally, he sends out a raven, which does not return, signaling that it is safe to leave. Utnapishtim exits the ark and offers sacrifices. As a reward, the gods grant him and his wife immortality. Interestingly, at one point, Utnapishtim is called Atrahasis. Whether deliberate or a mistake, it demonstrates clear ties to the Atrahasis tradition in this version of the flood story. As you might have noticed, this story closely mirrors the biblical tale of Noah's Ark. However, in Genesis, there's no council of gods, Yahweh alone decides to send the flood, and it's also Yahweh that warns Noah. Noah is instructed to build an ark nearly identical in size to those of the stories of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, 15,000 cubits squared. And as in the Ark Tablet, he is instructed to bring animals aboard in twos. In Genesis, there are some textual difficulties, and the flood either lasts 150 days or 40 days before the ark lands on the mountains of Ararat. Similarly to Gilgamesh, Noah sends out a raven, then a dove twice to check for dry land. Once the flood subsides, Noah offers sacrifices to Yahweh, who promises never to flood the world again. Scholars believe the Genesis authors were familiar with some form of the Mesopotamian traditions, borrowing the same basic plot and key details, such as the size of the ark, animals entering 2 by 2, the ark resting on a mountain, birds sent out, and the divine promise not to send a great flood again. There is even very similar language used between the two traditions. For example, Noah is told to coat the ark with pitch, using the rare Hebrew word kopher, which appears only once and likely derives from the Akkadian kupru, which also means pitch or bitumen, the same term used in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. For these reasons and more, scholars generally agree that the Noah's Ark story was inspired by earlier Mesopotamian traditions, plausibly after the exile of the Judeans by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, a period when learned Judean scribes would have been exposed to Mesopotamian tales like Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. Another region with a rich flood tradition is ancient Greece. The first story we will look at is actually a blend of the Babylonian traditions and Greek mythology. Berossus was a Babylonian writer who wrote in Greek, having been born under Alexander the Great's reign over Babylon between 330 and 323 BCE. In his version, the hero is Xisuthros, presumably the Greek name for Ziusudra, and the god who warns him is now the Greek deity Kronos. The story has many of the familiar beats, such as sending birds to find dry land and the hero offering sacrifices. Interestingly, the boat in Berossus is a longer boat like Noah's Ark, rather than the cube in Gilgamesh, meaning there may have been other older versions of the Babylonian story that are lost to time. The earliest truly Greek flood tradition appears in Plato, who briefly mentions a flood in the time of Deucalion. It isn't until Ovid's Metamorphosis in around 8 CE that we get a detailed account. King Deucalion, the son of Prometheus, is warned by his father that Zeus is planning to destroy humankind. He builds a boat and survives a flood that covers even the mountains. Some survived by climbing hills, though in Ovid's retelling they starve to death. After the waters recede, Deucalion's ship rests on a mountain, and he makes sacrifices to Zeus. The gods then help Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha repopulate the earth by turning stones into people. Another version from Phrygia records the goddess Athena creating mud images of humans and summoning the winds to breathe life into them. Scholars suspect that while the ancient Greeks added their own unique elements, the core of the story was inspired by their Near Eastern neighbours. But the ancient Greeks had other, less well-preserved flood legends too. Several sources mention a flood before Deucalion, survived by Ogyges, the mythical king of Thebes and Attica. This flood likely started as a local legend about Lake Copias. Another legend tells of Dardanus, the son of Zeus, who lived in Arcadia. When a great flood struck, those on the mountains survived, while Dardanus sailed to Samothrace. Unlike the Deucalion story, this flood didn't destroy the world, and not everyone perished. So early Greek myths may have drawn from Mesopotamian traditions, but there were also stories of localized floods woven into larger mythological narratives, explaining the origins of certain peoples and places. Now we move to the region that is modern-day India. The oldest surviving texts from this region, the Vedas, don't contain a flood story. But one text dating to around 1000 BCE contains a single line referring to the sliding down of a ship from a mountain, which may or may not be a reference to a flood story. The earliest complete flood story from India is found in the Shatapatha Brahmana. The written version dates to 300 BCE, but scholars believe it preserves older traditions from as far back as 700 BCE. In this tale, a man named Manu is washing in a river when a fish unexpectedly jumps into his hands. The fish warns him of an impending flood and promises to save Manu if he protects it from being eaten by a larger fish. Manu agrees and keeps the fish in a jar, but after it grows too large, he releases it into the sea, where it continues to grow with a large horn on its head. The fish then instructs Manu to prepare a vessel to survive the flood. When the waters rise, the fish ties a rope to the vessel and tows it through the floodwaters with its horn. The ship eventually comes to rest on a mountain, and Manu, the lone survivor, performs Vedic sacrifices, including pouring milk and butter into the waters. From the waters emerge a daughter, who is actually the deity Ida. The ending is somewhat obscure, but through further sacrifices, Manu repopulates the earth. Through her, he generated this race, which is the race of Manu. The story's purpose seems to be glorifying the Vedic ceremonies and rites as a means to increase or create a progeny. The story of Manu has many versions, including one found in the epic Mahabharata, which took shape over 800 years, starting in the 3rd century BCE. In this telling, Manu is joined by 7 divine sages, and the fish guiding him is actually the deity Prajapati Brahma. Although the Indian stories are unique with their fish imagery, you might recognize some common elements from the Mesopotamian legends. These include a deity warning the hero to build a vessel, a ship that lands on a mountain, and the survivors repopulating the earth. And several scholars do suggest a link between the Mesopotamian traditions and the Indian accounts. Notably, in the Mesopotamian versions, the god Enki, who warns the hero, is associated with fish imagery, just like it is a fish that warns Manu. In several of the Mesopotamian versions, the hero is told to bring seed onto the boat, a metaphor for people and animals. In the Manu story, he is instructed to carry literal seeds of all kinds aboard the ship. Scholars suggest this may have been the result of a misunderstanding of seed in the Mesopotamian traditions. The similarities between these flood stories might be traced to ancient trade routes linking the Indus Valley with Mesopotamian centres like Sumer. These connections could have facilitated the exchange of ideas and explained the striking similarities between traditions. Thus far, we've already seen some fascinating overlaps, but the major traditions from the Bible, ancient Greece, and even India all share some kind of link to the earlier Mesopotamian tales. They are part of a shared literary tradition developed through cultural contact. Many of the legends we have looked at describe the destruction of all people, save for a chosen few. But do all flood myths envision the destruction of humankind? As we move to ancient China, we see a very different kind of flood story. There are early references to Yu the Great, in which he is commanded by the sky to dig channels along the mountains so that the rivers would flow into the sea. This is not a flood story per se, rather it explains agriculture. The Yu legend becomes a kind of flood story in the early chapters of Shangshu, dating to the Warring States period. In this story, Emperor Yao is faced with severe flooding, making human habitation difficult. Yao initially assigns a man named Gun to manage the flood, but Gun fails in his efforts. Gun is imprisoned and ultimately succeeded by Yu, who successfully controls the flooding by channeling rivers and redirecting water to the sea. In these flood stories, the people are not wiped out. Instead, they are finding it difficult to live in the floodplains until Yu redirects the waters. Yu's taming of the flood is linked to the dividing up of China into regions and the importance of agriculture and sending tribute to the capital. It was not a story about a global flood. In fact, in the Middle Ages, the Chinese reportedly rejected the notion of a global flood. According to Abu Zaid al-Sarafi, in the 900s CE, an Arab traveller named Ibn Wahab visited China and discussed the flood of Noah. The emperor informed him that such a flood did not reach China. So not all flood legends feature the total destruction of humanity. But China does have some regional traditions that bear some closer resemblance to the biblical story. For example, the Yi people, an ethnic group in the Yunnan province, do have a deluge legend. A semi-divine patriarch named Segudzi sends a message to Earth demanding flesh and blood from a mortal. Only one man complied, Du-Mu. Out of anger, Segudzi brings forth a flood. Du-Mu and his 4 sons survive in a hollow tree with a few animals. The Chinese are descended from Du-Mu's sons. Other peoples are descended from wooden figures made by Du-Mu. The tale was recorded by Augustine Henry in 1903. Henry suspected that the motif of surviving a flood in a vessel was influenced by the biblical tale, as there were Christian missionaries in the region from as early as 635 CE. While we might infer some Christian influences on the legend of the Yi people, as we move to wider Europe, we start to see more clearly the influence of earlier stories on later traditions. A legend from Iceland recorded in 1222 in the Prose Edda tells a story about the 3 sons of the Norse god Bor, Odin, Willi, and Way. Together they slew the giant Ymir. However, his wounds gushed so much blood it flooded all the other giants. One giant named Bergelmir escaped with his wife in a boat. The sons used the carcass to form the world, and the blood became oceans and rivers. The legend probably has a Germanic core, and it is worth noting that Iceland converted to Christianity in 1000. The author Snorri Sturluson often recorded Norse myth through a Christian lens, so there's likely Christian influence at work here. Moving on to Wales, the Celtic Welsh triads allegedly contain a flood story in which the death of the lake monster, Afanc, causes all the lands to flood. Only Dwyfan and Dwyfach survive on a ship they built, carrying pairs of animals. Wales had been Christianized by the 7th century. Even so, this story does not appear in the earliest versions of the Welsh triads. It first surfaces in the 1800s in the work of Iolo Morganwg. Morganwg was known to have forged some of his material, and his writings reflect his Christian influences. Thus, the short tale of Dwyfan and Dwyfach is probably influenced by the biblical Noah's Ark. The Romani have a story about a man who kept a fish in a small vessel. His wife wants to eat it, but the husband promises an old man that he would protect it. The wife can't help herself and roasts the fish. This causes a great flood to rain down. The husband and wife survive by building a boat and taking animals and seeds to repopulate the earth. The fish in a vessel recalls the Indian story of Manu, which makes sense because the Romani people are believed to have migrated west from India starting in the Middle Ages. So we're starting to see how many flood legends around the world can trace their origins to earlier traditions. Turning now to Africa, one of the most surprising regions that does not have a cataclysmic flood story is Egypt. As far as we know, there is no deluge myth from ancient Egypt, which is surprising given the wealth of ancient texts we have uncovered and the fact that Egypt bordered Mesopotamia. The flooding of the Nile did feature prominently in Egyptian writing, such as the hymn to the god Hapi, who represented the inundation of the Nile River. But there is nothing like the destructive flood stories we have looked at so far. Other flood stories from the African continent come to us only from post-colonial encounters. Early explorers like the famous Dr. Livingstone and missionary Dr. Robert Moffat noted that they could not find any local flood stories that had not been learned from missionaries. The Maasai in Kenya have a flood story in which God is angry at the first murder and he floods the world. He chooses one man to save his wives, sons, and animals on a boat. The man lets a dove out to see if there's dry land, and finally a rainbow appears to show the wrath of God was over. Researchers suggest that this tale was influenced either by Islam or Christianity. Islam was present in the region since at least the 8th century, and Catholic missionaries arrived in the 1500s, well before the first recording of this story in the late 1800s. Another story with some similarities to the biblical tradition is a Nigerian Yoruba legend recorded in 1894. The story tells of how Orunmila, the divine spirit of divination, grows tired of the world and goes to live in the sky. The people, now deprived of his presence, don't know how to interpret the desires of the gods, and most of the gods grow annoyed. The water god Olokun, in a fit of rage, nearly destroys the world by sending a flood. A few are saved by the divine spirit Obatala, who draws people up to the sky with an iron chain. Afterwards, the world is just mud, so Orunmila comes down and makes it habitable again. A.B. Ellis, who recorded the story, suspected that the Yoruba adapted it from Islamic missionaries, but we can't know for sure. Regardless, it is clear that at least some flood stories on the African continent have some links to the biblical tradition. But many of the other stories from the African continent are not about widespread destruction. Rather, they explain local traditions or geographic features like lakes. A Kaka legend from Cameroon, first recorded in 1966, tells of a girl grinding flour when she is approached by a goat trying to eat the flour. She tries to drive the goat away, but the goat persists. She eventually lets the goat eat its fill. In return, the goat warns her of an impending flood and that she should flee with her brother. The village is destroyed, but the brother and sister survive by fleeing to a remote place. One day, the goat returns and tells them they can marry in order to have children and repopulate. What is interesting is that the motif of a brother and sister being saved from a calamity and having to reproduce can also be found in China and India. A Tanzanian choir story recorded in the 1960s tells of a man who kept a small pot that contained the ocean. He warns his daughter-in-law not to touch the pot, but one day she grows curious and touches it. It shatters, and water gushes out and drowns everything. The story explains how the lakes and rivers formed. There are also other flood stories that explain the existence of local geographic features. These are all very different to the cataclysmic deluge stories about a flood sent by an angry deity. As we move to South America, we start to see just how much more diverse and varied flood legends can be. All of the tales we have from South America are first recorded after Portuguese and Spanish colonists arrived in the 1500s. Frenchman André Thevet recounts a story from Cape Frio of two brothers who are having an argument. During their fight, the village gets transported up to the heavens, but they remain on Earth. The first brother stomps his foot in anger so hard that a spring of water bursts up. Water continues to gush out until the whole world is covered. The two brothers survive by climbing trees with their wives, while all the other people drown. It is said that two different tribes who are always feuding are descended from these two couples. Further south, the Kangang have a story about a great flood that covered all but the Serra de Mar mountains. 3 tribes swam on the waters towards the mountains, but only the Kangang tribe survived. They made it to the mountains and climbed trees to avoid the waters. The waters showed no signs of receding until the people saw some waterfowl birds carrying baskets of earth. When they dropped the earth into the waters, the flood started to recede. More birds joined until there was enough room for all the survivors. When the Kangang descended and settled the land, the souls of those who drowned were released, and they formed many species of native animals, including dangerous animals like pumas and snakes. The Incas have a flood story called Unu Pachacuti. One version, recorded in the 1500s by Sarmiento de Gamboa, recounts how the deity, Viracocha, created a race of giants. but they became unruly, so Viracocha wiped them out with a flood. 2 brothers survived on a high mountain. As the waters rose, the mountain also got higher. The 2 men eventually encountered 2 women. However, one day one of the brothers drowns, and the surviving brother has offspring with the women. It's important to note that in recounting these stories, Sarmiento de Gamboa had contempt for the indigenous people, thinking their stories to be the devil's lies. In a passage he wrote, "As these barbarous nations of Indians were always without letters, they had not the means of preserving the monuments and memorials of their times, and those of their predecessors with accuracy and method. As the devil, who is always striving to injure the human race, found these unfortunates to be easy of belief and timid in obedience, he introduced many illusions, lies, and frauds." Similarly, another flood legend was recorded by a Spanish clergyman, Cristobal de Molina, in the 1500s, in which the deity repopulates the earth by forming humans out of clay. Molina is accused of merging myths from the Incas with the biblical tradition. This highlights some of the issues we face when evaluating these stories. The early colonists who recounted these stories many times thought the indigenous flood stories to be inferior or a corruption of the biblical tradition. So it's difficult to know how that coloured their retellings of the stories. But, as we have seen in Africa and South America, many of these stories are very unlike the biblical tradition. Instead, they are etiological. They explain local geographic features, or tribal origins, or how people came to settle in specific areas. But we have very little idea how old these traditions are. But as we move up to Central and North America, we have some of the few examples of flood stories that are definitely pre-colonial on the continent. The Maya were an indigenous people from the southern half of the Gulf of Mexico. A temple at the Palenque archaeological site in Mexico, dating to the 8th century CE, depicts what might be a flood myth. Hieroglyphs in the temple allude to the sacrificial decapitation of a celestial water animal called the starry deer crocodile, followed by a great outpouring of blood. Scholars believe the passage may allude to Mayan ideas about the decapitation of a celestial crocodile causing the world to be destroyed and renewed through a deluge of blood. Nearby to the Maya were the Aztecs. But first, a little note on the term Aztec. It's a term most people are familiar with, but it is debated. It's a loose umbrella term for pre-Columbian tribes indigenous to central Mexico, who trace their origin to Aztlan, a legendary paradise, but it doesn't encompass all tribes from central Mexico. With that caveat in mind, the Aztec Sunstone, a carving produced in the 1500s, describes how humans were destroyed 4 times. First, jaguars ate all the humans. Then, hurricanes wreaked havoc and all the humans turned into monkeys. Then, the world was destroyed by fire and all the humans turned into turkeys. Finally, a great flood destroyed the world and all the humans turned into fish. According to this legend, the world we live in is then in its 5th and final iteration. This is generally called Fifth World mythology, and it's not unique to the Aztecs. It can be found in several Mesoamerican tribes, as well as further north among the Navajo. A written version of the Aztec legend, called Leyenda de los Soles, Legend of the Suns, was recorded in 1558. This version details how Tezcatlipoca warned a man and his wife about the coming flood. They survived in a huge hollow log. After the flood, they were famished, so they made a fire and cooked fish. The smoke rose up to the gods, which made them angry, so Tezcatlipoca descended and turned them into dogs. Another indigenous Mexican people, the Hoycal, have a flood legend about a woodsman who gets warned by the goddess of earth Nakawe in the form of an old woman. She warns him of a flood and to build a box and take grains and beans and a black female dog. He is at sea for 5 years until he lands near Santa Catarina. The world is still underwater, but the birds like macaws and parrots start pecking at the mountains with their beaks, turning them into valleys, and the flood subsides. The woodsman lives with the dog until one day the dog takes off its skin and becomes a woman. They live together and have a large family, repopulating the earth. This is just one of at least a dozen different dog-wife stories where a dog becomes a woman that can be found in Central America and even as far as the Pacific. It's also worth noting the similarity to the South American legend we looked at, where birds create the land by dropping it from the sky. There are also many flood stories from Central America which are clearly adaptations of Noah's Ark learned from missionaries. The Cora, Zapotec, and Tarascan tribes all have legends incorporating biblical characters like Noah, Adam, Eve, and more in a flood myth. Moving further north, American Indian tribes also had flood myths, though they are only recorded in post-colonial times after the 1800s. Tribes in California, like the Ashamen, sang songs of a flood that covered the hills, and only a few survived by going to a high mountain. The Cherokee have a tradition where a dog warns a man about a flood. The man builds a boat and saves his family, and from him, the population of the world is descended. There is a story found among several tribes where a man is saved from a flood on a raft. He has a beaver dive down to get some mud, but it's too deep. Next, an otter tries, but also fails. Finally, he has a muskrat dive down. This time, the rat comes back with a little mud. The man uses that mud to form the world and all the people. Variants of this motif are found across many tribes and regions. Finally, some tribes like the Tsimshian have a canoe story in which people survive a flood in canoes and are scattered to different parts of the country, leading to the diversity of tribes. This is particularly interesting because many Pacific Island nations also have canoe flood stories, which serve a similar purpose. There's many other stories too, but these give you a sense of the wide diversity of traditions. The final region we will look at is Oceania. The Indigenous Australians are believed to have lived on the continent from around 50,000 years ago. While they did have a vibrant artistic tradition preserved today in rock art as old as 17,000 years ago, they did not have a written language. As such, all of our accounts of Indigenous flood stories come from after the post-colonial period, beginning in 1788. Some stories betray missionary influences, but others do preserve pre-colonial traditions. One such story, and perhaps the most well-known, is a Dreamtime story called Tiddalik the Frog. There once was a terrible drought that scorched all the land. All the animals, emus, wombats, koalas, kangaroos, and more, gathered together for a meeting. They discovered an enormous frog had swallowed all the water, causing the drought. They decided if they could make the frog laugh, then all the water would be spat out. The kookaburra tried laughing, but Tiddalik gave no reaction. The frill-necked lizard tried expanding its frill, but it still didn't work. Then the eel suggested it could do the job. Eel began contorting and twisting itself into all sorts of shapes. At this, the frog burst out laughing, and all the water gushed out. There was so much water that only the highest peaks remained dry. In some versions, there were no survivors. In others, the pelican is rescuing survivors in a canoe, but after a woman betrays him, he paints himself half white in war paint. The story explains why the pelican is black and white. In modern times, it has become a popular children's tale, omitting death and destruction in favour of a moral lesson about greed. We don't know in exactly what contexts the original story may have been told. One theory is that the story is connected to burrowing frogs, which in times of drought gorge themselves on water and burrow underground until the next rainfall. One scholar writes, "The people know this. When there is a drought, they dig them up for water." But it is also a cosmological story about balance in the environment and the way people relate to each other. In the Northern Territory, there are also many stories about the rainbow serpent. In one, the Wawalik sisters are camping with their children when some menstrual blood falls into a waterhole. The rainbow serpent smells it and crawls out of his well. He spits some water into the sky and it starts to rain. Before the women can escape, he swallows them and their children. The serpent then stands up straight and tall, and the floodwaters rise as high as he does. When he lowers himself, the waters recede and there is dry ground. In some versions, he releases the women at the end. This is another example of a Dreamtime flood story that is pre-colonial. However, other flood stories are more clearly influenced by missionaries. In another flood legend from Western Australia, there is an ark that floats over the St. George's Ranges and carries Indigenous people, Noah, and animals. In some versions, the white people perished in the flood, and this is why they didn't return until Captain Cook's arrival. Also, in some versions, the ark has a mast like a tall ship. Researchers discovered this flood myth may have developed to explain a rock site, which to some resembles a ship. The original reteller of this story was an Indigenous man who was well versed in the biblical traditions. Australia is a great example of how pre-colonial flood legends like Tiddalik and the rainbow serpent can be quite diverse and different from the well-known Mesopotamian and biblical tradition, yet post-colonial legends adopted some of the well-known biblical motifs after contact with missionaries. Across the ditch in New Zealand, there is a Maori myth known as Parawanamia. In this story, the tribe split up and forgot the worship of their founding gods. Parawanamia and his father tried to keep the faith, but were made fun of. They wanted to convince the people of the gods' power, so they made a raft and prayed for rain. The rains came and everyone on the raft survived, but the others perished. Those on the raft thanked Parawanamia and they repopulated the country. Professor Paul Moon sees this as a blend of an Indigenous tale that both assimilated but also resisted the Christian missionary traditions. Many Maori were caught between a desire for the material benefits of Christianity, yet they did not wish to reject and anger their native gods. The story encourages the Maori to retain their traditional beliefs while also assimilating elements from the biblical story. Another clear example of missionary influence is found in Hawaii. The Hawaiian flood legend is found in a story about the discovery of Hawaii called Hawaii Loa. A Hawaiian named Nu'u survives a great flood in a giant canoe with a house on top of it. The vessel lands on the peaks of Mauna Kea. Nu'u makes an offering to the god Kane, and in response, Kane descends and speaks to Nu'u. Afterward, he ascends on a rainbow, which he leaves as a sign of his forgiveness. Now, Hawaiians acquired writing during the 19th century from Christian missionaries who taught them the Bible, so there are no pre-Christian writings. The authors of the tradition of Hawaii Loa were Christian converts and were influenced in their translation by biblical motifs such as Noah, the Ark, and the rainbow. As one scholar put it, at the time it was recorded in writing, many Hawaiian had become Christianized and were familiar with biblical history. The temptation to interpret certain incidents similar to those in biblical history as being in fact the Hawaiian rendering of biblical events seems to have influenced the translators. Like many cultures, there probably was a pre-Christian flood tradition, but we do not know its details. While many of the regions of the world have a flood legend, there are also many significant cultures that do not. We have already looked at Egypt, which has no true deluge legend. There is a tale of a flood of beer, however, it is very unlike the deluge legends we have covered. The absence of a widespread flood legend in Egypt is surprising, given the close proximity and trade with both Babylon and Greece. Another region missing a flood legend is ancient Persia, now Iran. In Zoroastrian texts, there is a tale of a widespread winter, but no flood. The Japanese have a writing system that dates back to the 5th century CE. Yet there is no preserved deluge legend. There are also thousands of unique people groups all around the world that have no flood legends that predate the arrival of Christian and Islamic missionaries. So while it is a very widespread legend, it is not universal. Having looked at flood legends from all around the world, let's return to a popular claim. Do these widespread stories point to a real, global flood in human history? Despite popular claims, scientists overwhelmingly agree a global flood never happened. First, Earth lacks enough water to submerge all land. Second, there's no supporting geological evidence for such a catastrophe. And finally, there is evidence of continuous human and animal populations during the variously proposed flood periods. While flood legends can be found all around the world, the actual stories are so diverse and varied, ruling out the possibility that they stem from a single event. These stories are not historical accounts of a worldwide deluge. But do flood legends preserve memories of more localized flood events? The idea that myths may preserve memories of real natural disasters is known as geomythology, a term coined by geologists in the 1960s. It is likely that some of these stories had their origin in the memory of a real local flooding event. Floods are terrifying even today, so it makes sense that myths would develop around floods. But it's rarely possible to make definitive claims linking particular stories to historic flood events, especially the further you go back in history. An example of this is in the 1990s, there was a popular theory that the flooding of the Black Sea 8,000 years ago inspired the Mesopotamian flood myths and Noah's Ark. However, a 2022 review of all papers published on the topic found that there was no sudden flood, rather the sea level rose gradually. Moreover, while some flood stories may have once upon a time been inspired by a real flood, the written stories that survive do not preserve the details of a historic flood. The flood is usually a plot device in a larger narrative about the humans' relationship with the gods, each other, and nature. None of the stories we have looked at contain the kinds of detail that could link them to a specific event. And that's not unique to flood stories. There are also earthquake and tornado myths from around the world and across history. And these natural disasters occur with a regular frequency. But it is not possible to link myths around these disasters to specific tornadoes, earthquakes, and floods. The reason flood legends are so much more prevalent than other disaster myths is explained by geologist Dorothy Vitaliano. Flood traditions are nearly universal, mainly because floods in the plural are the most universal of geologic catastrophes. So then, how do we explain the similarities in the stories? The first reason is that numerous details in these stories are intuitive. Many flood myths from different continents share common themes, such as a flood being a punishment from a deity, or survivors repopulating the earth. These similarities, however, can often be attributed to their intuitive nature. For example, in the contexts these stories were produced, it made sense to interpret a catastrophic event as the result of a deity's anger, as this offers a clear explanation for the disaster. Intuitive details are found in other types of legends too. Earthquake myths among cultures like the ancient Greeks, the Incas, the Maori, and more often involve a god or monster whose movements cause the shaking of the earth. Tornado and whirlwind myths are also found in many cultures. Among numerous North American tribes, the whirlwind is typically personified as a female deity linked to agriculture and seasonal change. In contrast, in regions such as Africa and Australia, the whirlwind is usually a male fertility spirit who impregnates women. The similarities among various earthquake and whirlwind myths do not suggest a single historical event or shared origin. It was intuitive to attribute an earthquake to the movement of a god. It was intuitive to attribute a catastrophic flood to a deity. Likewise, if a story involves survivors of a flood, there are only so many plausible ways for them to escape. A boat is the most obvious solution, but myths from around the world also include other methods, such as climbing a mountain or a tree. Some stories are also etiological. They explain why things are the way they are. Some are creative attempts to account for specific local geographical features like lakes. Other tales may explain why tribal ancestors settled and lived in certain places. Still, other tales are cosmological. They explain human origins and why the world is the way it is, and humanity's relationship with the gods. Finally, as we have seen, only a small subset of flood stories are truly ancient, and the earliest Near Eastern stories likely derive from the same literary tradition. However, many, especially those that resemble the story of Noah's Ark, were shaped by the influence of the Bible, spread by Christian and Islamic missionaries. This is complicated by the fact that most of the stories we have were recorded only in post-colonial times. Sometimes it's clear that colonial historians brought their own biases into the recording of these tales. At other times, Indigenous peoples blended parts of their stories with details learned through missionary contact. Flood myths are found all over the world, but they don't preserve the memory of a global flood, or even local floods. They are diverse traditions that are full of symbolism and shaped by a variety of experiences and cultural imaginations. Hopefully you've learned something new about one of the most widespread types of myths and legends. This video was made possible by ArtThink, a research organisation advancing the academic study of religion in my home country of Australia. If you like this video, help make complex scholarship accessible through videos like this by supporting the channel on Patreon. Until next time,